Senator Murkowski is a third-generation Alaskan, the first Alaskan-born senator, and only of 6 U.S. senators from the state to serve the state of Alaska. Since joining the Senate in 2002, Senator Murkowski has been a strong advocate for Alaska on the important issues facing the state, including energy, health care, education, military and veterans affairs, and infrastructure development. Senator Murkowski is a senior Republican member of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee and also serves on the Senate Appropriations Committee, where she is the ranking Republican on the Interior and Environmental Subcommittees. We have the honor to have Senator Murkowski with us today. Senator Murkowski, please.
I thank you for the invitation to be with you today and talk about some good news. You know, we're spending a lot of time up on Capitol Hill nowadays, feeling like we're pushing big rocks uphill. So it's nice to talk about an area where I think we have opportunity, and to be able to be with you here today and to focus on our nation's mining industry. To me, that's good news. So I like to be in a spot where we can kind of shine the light on some issues where we do have opportunities as a nation. I don't think enough attention is being paid to the positive impacts that mining has on our daily lives, on our economy. Too often, I think we forget that a stable and affordable supply of minerals is absolutely critical to our nation's ability to compete in a very rapidly changing world. And I'm regularly reminding my colleagues that, look, minerals are those building blocks of our economy, whether it's the rare earth elements, whether it's molybdenum. We rely on our minerals for just about everything from the smallest computer chips to the buildings that we're in. And I always tell them, I said, you know, every one of you, I bet every single person in this room has some kind of a cell phone, smartphone, BlackBerry, something that wouldn't be operating were it not for the minerals that are contained within it. It makes it possible for us to innovate, to invent, and really in the process to shape our standard of living and our ability to prosper. So when I was putting together comments to be before you today, you know, really, where do you start in this conversation? I think it really is a critical time in the industry for mining. It's also a very busy time for the industry as you're simultaneously trying new projects, and at the same time you're trying to keep pace with the federal agencies that are cranking out regulation after regulation after regulation. So let me start by highlighting some of the challenges that the mining industry is facing, and then perhaps some of the successes that we've seen, and then I'll wrap up by telling you about the legislation that I've been working on to bring our nation's mineral policies forward into the 21st century. First, the challenges. As you all know, I know that you've discussed this morning, we are 100% dependent on foreign countries for rare earth elements. Not just partially dependent like we are when we talk about petroleum, but we are wholly and completely dependent on others. And making matters worse, the main producer of rare earths, China, is actively manipulating both the availability and the price of supply. And that's a big problem. The arrangement is distinctly to China's advantage, not to ours. It has significant consequences for our competitiveness as well as our security. Rare earths, of course, have received a lot of the attention, not only in the news, but also with Congress. But when you really start to look at our dependence on foreign nations for all critical minerals, I think you realize that the rare earths are really just the tip of the iceberg here. There's no question that a stable and affordable supply of minerals is key to our competitiveness here in this country. And yet, despite that, our mineral-related capabilities have been slipping, and they've been slipping for a period of years, for decades. We are now 100% dependent on foreign suppliers for 18 different minerals, including the rare earths, and more than 50% dependent on foreign sources for some 25 more. According to USGS, our nation is clearly headed in the wrong direction. We're becoming more and more dependent on foreign suppliers for more and more of our mineral commodities. And this isn't happening because we lack the mineral resources. That's not the story here. It's happening despite our pretty tremendous mineral resource base. Above all else, it is the federal regulatory system that has slowed down the exploration, the permitting, and ultimately the number of mines that can successfully operate here in this country. And this is a problem that has grown over a course of decades before reaching really a fever pitch that we've seen over the past couple years. We now have what the coal mining crowd refers to as EPA's train wreck of new regulations. At absolutely breakneck speed, what we're seeing is EPA as well as other agencies that are literally churning out major rules for greenhouse gas emissions, Clean Water Act guidance, maximum available control technologies at power plants. This is just to name just a few here. The EPA has retroactively vetoed valid mine permits in West Virginia, which not only deprived the state of much-needed jobs, but also established a dangerous precedent for new mines all over the country. Now, for its part, the Office of Surface Mining has written a rule that would eliminate some 7,000 coal mining jobs here in this country. And then what they did is they fired their own consulting firm for crunching the numbers that showed just how bad this rule was going to be. More recently, of course, the administration has announced that it will fold OSM, the Office of Surface Mining, into the Bureau of Land Management. I don't believe that the administration has the authority to do that on its own, and at this point in time, I'm not convinced that that's the right move either. The crush of regulations is also hitting our hard rock producers. EPA has begun a rulemaking to impose bonding requirements on our mining companies that are already required to post bonds by the BLM, by Forest Service, and by the states. It's already apparent that the EPA program would result in drastically higher costs, and that means fewer projects, fewer jobs, fewer minerals, which, again, takes us down that wrong path in terms of our mineral developments. So the stories in terms of what's happening around the country and efforts to just kind of systematically take things off the books continue. In Arizona, we've seen the withdrawal of 100 million acres of federal land, all of high-grade uranium, because the Interior Department and the Park Service have set out to create highly restrictive buffer zones outside the boundaries of the parks. On the more creative side of the ledger, perhaps, EPA has undertaken what they're calling a watershed assessment of Alaska's Bristol Bay region. This is a huge, huge region. This was in response to petitions to preemptively veto a mine. Preemptively veto a mine before the project has even been defined. It kind of follows on the actions that were taken in West Virginia with that retroactive veto there. But from these examples alone, I think it's clear that from exploration activities and small mining operations to our larger projects and the permitting process that really has to be navigated to bring them online, the federal bureaucracy has made it more and more difficult to invest in mining projects here in this country. Having said all that, I'm one of those people that likes to believe that the glass is always half full. I think that there are some areas of hope. In Alaska, in my state, we managed to prevent the EPA from knocking the Kensington gold mine off course. It's now begun operations, and that is good for us and our jobs and the revenues that come to Alaska. We've seen renewed domestic interest in rare earth elements. In Alaska alone, we've already identified some 70 different sites, 70 different sites with rare earth potential. In California, we've seen some good news from Molycorp, which plans to reopen its Mountain Pass mine after having been idle for about 9 years now. And then when you think about jobs, we're all talking about jobs up on Capitol Hill. But the mining industry has been one area where, again, we do see opportunities. The mining industry has been a strong source of job creation. I don't know how many of you saw this interim report that came out from the President's Council on Jobs and Competitiveness. If you pull that report up, on page 11, there's a chart there that shows the employment trends here in this country from December '07 to today. And it shouldn't come as any surprise to those of you in the room, but the only sector that actually has recorded positive job growth during this period of time is not manufacturing, it's not construction, it's not retail services, it is in mining. So I think that is good news. That news needs to get out there more than it is, buried as it is within the jobs report there. This is encouraging and needs to be discussed. So there is some reason for optimism. The domestic mining industry has held its own in recent years, despite some pretty significant odds that I've detailed at the front here. But again, when you look at the trends in our foreign mineral dependence, when you look at the crush of the new regulations that really threatens to set domestic mining back so very significantly, it's hard to argue that everything is really okay, that glass really is half full. So we've been working in the Congress to address, by way of legislation, some paths forward. And I've been working on minerals legislation to revitalize the critical mineral supply chain. Earlier this year, I introduced a bill that we're calling the Critical Minerals Policy Act. It is enjoying a rare spurt of bipartisanship. We've got 19 members that are signed on this bill, 9 Democrats, 10 Republicans. That's really actually bipartisan. What the bill does is it provides some clear programmatic direction to keep the U.S. competitive. It will ensure that the federal government's mineral policies, some of which have not been updated since the 1980s, are brought into the 21st century. It requires that USGS generate a list of minerals that are critical to our U.S. economy. So it's not just focused on keying in on the rare earths, as important as they are, but really those critical minerals that we need within our nation's economy. It outlines a comprehensive set of policies that will bolster the production of these minerals. It expands manufacturing, promotes recycling and alternatives, and all the while maintaining strong environmental standards. Now, given some of the pretty harsh, I guess, or rash reactions that we see anytime anyone introduces a bill on mining, letting alone permitting, I think it is important to note that my legislation would not amend or weaken a single environmental statute. So you'll hear some cries from people saying, you know, we're trying to just eliminate or shortcut the permitting process. That is not the case. Mining operations are subject to no less than 30 federal, state, and local regulatory programs. And as a country, I think that we should be proud of and maintain the commitment that we have displayed over generations to being good stewards of the natural environment. Now, there's no question that mining has an impact on the land. It has an environmental impact. In order to mine, you have to dig a hole. And some people really just don't like to think about the fact that you've got to dig a hole. But we've also got to acknowledge that the national interests that are served by reducing our reliance on foreign critical mineral supplies, and understand that these projects are pursued in more modern and more responsible ways here at home in this country than they are anywhere else in the world. So I would encourage all of you, keep focusing on the issues that are brought up in this conference, both for rare earths and other critical minerals. Take a look at my bill. It's Senate Bill 1113. 1113. If you like what you see, I'd encourage you to join me in talking to others about it, making the case for passage. Talk to your senators, talk to your representatives, talk to mining companies and the companies that rely on these minerals to make their own products, and encourage them to do the same. When I was home in Alaska a couple of weeks ago, I reminded my friends there that you don't have to be in the mining business in order to appreciate and understand why this is so critical. If you're in the manufacturing business, you should be concerned about what's going on in mining in this country. you should be focused on this. So join me in this. The Critical Minerals Policy Act, I think, offers an opportunity for us to update our mineral policies, but also to ensure that the United States produces the raw materials that make so much of our modern world really possible. This is about strengthening our economy. This is about creating jobs, attracting investment, competing with other nations around the world. This is an opportunity to really help ensure that new products and new technologies continue to bear the Made in USA stamp. Let's make it possible all the way up the chain. And at the end of the day, that's what our focus on minerals really is all about. It's why we need to look for those solutions to the very real problems that are associated with our growing dependence on foreign minerals. It's why we need to make sure that our regulations don't restrict domestic producers or force them to go elsewhere. And it's why we need to make sure that our federal policies on mining are updated to really reflect the needs and the challenges that we face today, not some 30 years ago. So I wish you well in your meetings this afternoon, and greatly appreciate the focus that you are giving to this very critical issue of the very beginning of that supply chain that's so important to us. So I thank you for giving me some time this afternoon. Don't know whether it's appropriate to take questions, but if so, I'm happy to do that. I think it needs to be impressed upon, particularly our young people, that this is a career opportunity. And young people, I've got two teenagers. I've got an 18-year-old and a 20-year-old, so I'm an expert on this. But they want to be focused on the equipment, the gadgets. They want to all be working in this high-tech world. And what I tell my boys is the high-tech doesn't happen until you're able to kind of put it all together. How do you put it all together? Where do these building blocks come from? And I keep taking it back to Mother Earth. So it is an opportunity if our young people understand how this all connects together. So it is about education and how we convey those messages. And I think it's important to recognize also, and I come from a state that not only has incredible mineral resource, but we're the oil and gas industry up north. That's what has sustained our state now for the past 30 years. I think there's a little bit of stigma right now. There's a lot of people in my state that don't really want to admit that I work for Exxon or that I work for BP, and they kind of hang their heads, and yet they're making a good living, providing for their families, providing for a resource that this country needs, providing jobs and opportunities for others. And as I tell them, I said, there is no reason to be ashamed of the fact that you are producing a resource that is valued in this country. And I think mining is exactly the same way. I think sometimes you have young people that look at that and say that there's a stigma attached to it, that we should all be environmental stewards. We should. But a miner can be an environmental steward. Those who work within the mining industry can be just as careful and cautious as anybody else there. So there's no reason that we should look at this as an industry that does not hold equal stature with somebody who's, say, for instance, in the high tech. We ought not let those careers be denigrated.
Is your policy addressing this, or has to be part of the immigration reform?
It's not included in my critical minerals legislation, but it is an important aspect of what it is that we're trying to build out and develop through this legislation. But you're right, if you don't have the skill sets, if you don't have that educational background, how are we going to build this out? How are we going to be competitive? It is something that needs to be addressed through our immigration policies, and I am one who wants to encourage those great minds. Share with us, help build some great things here. I don't want us to constantly be in the situation where we've got the good ideas that start here, but they're being implemented in other countries because we haven't been able to attract and retain and build that talent here. So they need to be working together. I'll be honest with you, in my state, we've got great mining opportunities that are underway right now. And our university system just finished the last training program that they had to bring those in the mining industry on. So my state doesn't have a program right now. That concerns me. So I'm going to be addressing that. But it's an important aspect to what it is that we're facing with the challenges. We need to be on top of the technology. In order to do that, we need some pretty smart people here.
Senator, quick question. How are the negotiations going to get your bill towards the markup?
Well, as a matter of fact, I'm probably going to be having a meeting on that this afternoon. I'm hopeful with the chairman of the committee, Chairman Bingaman. There are, as you know, there are other critical minerals and rare earth element bills that are out there that have been introduced by other members. In my previous conversations with the chairman, he's indicated that, you know, if there are ways that we might be able to marry some of these up, that would be a good thing. I've indicated that it's again somewhat unusual nowadays to have this much support on a bill that is clearly bipartisan like this, and that my bill should be the one that kind of takes the lead. But I am more than willing, more than eager to be working with my other colleagues to figure out how we incorporate the elements that they have in theirs to make the vehicle stronger. So we are working pretty aggressively on this. I mentioned the issue of the concerns from some that we are pulling the rug out from underneath the permitting process here, and that is a concern that is shared by some of my colleagues. I think part of that concern can be allayed when they understand clearly what it is that we put in place with this legislation and what is not there. So it goes back to the point about education. You need to be clearly educated on the bill. So I am hopeful that we will be able to proceed. I have made this a real priority of mine, so trying to move that through the committee, and I'm hopeful that we're going to see something within the next, I would hope within the next, probably not before Thanksgiving because our clock is running, but before the end of the year.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Aside from that legislation, are you aware of any type of activity or forum in Congress that will address these huge issues of permitting and bonding and regulation on the environmental aspects and other issues that are creating larger and larger barriers to entry for the mining industry?
You know, there's not so much a forum or a conference or a caucus. We're dealing with this kind of this onslaught of regulation in so many different issue areas. Mining is, of course, particularly hard hit. We talk about that here, but in so many other areas, it is kind of this pile-on that we're sensing. And it's not just sensing. I mean, it is real. It is there. There's some efforts within the legislative process to kind of rein this back in. There are some vehicles that have been introduced as standalone bills that would call for a one-year timeout on any new regulations. There are legislative efforts that would repeal some that are in play through the appropriations process. We've seen some of the riders that the House has been successful in advancing that would again kind of dial this back. This is a big issue for us. It is a fight in the Congress right now between what we're seeing coming out of the agencies and the impact to industry as a whole, and then the impact to the economy as a whole. Are we making any headway? I think a little bit. Are we making enough headway to make a difference? I don't believe so. This is something that we're working on with our colleagues in the House to again try to make a difference. When we're talking about the jobs and job creation and the strength of our economy, one of the things that I keep hearing is not everything costs money. Not everything that we need to do requires a stimulus or a bailout. What we could do as a government is dial down some of these regulations, allow industry to move forward and go to work. And that's actually going to be more of a job creator than anything else that we might do. So we continue to push that, but we're met with an awful lot of stiff winds.
Senator, along those same lines, Representative Kaufman has proposed stockpiling, which might cost some money. I'm not sure about how it works out, but do you envision that as being possibly an item that you could support?
I think it is something that we need to consider, and of course these are some of the areas that we've asked to know and understand more. I am very cognizant that at a time when we are looking under every rock, literally, for revenues, that those initiatives that will require additional sums are going to be more heavily scrutinized, and that it's tough to advance new programs that are going to have a price tag to them. Now, having said that, there's some pretty important investments I think that we need to make as a country, and I think that we need to better know what we have when it comes to our mineral resources, whether it's understanding our inventories or knowing that there is a stockpile.
Thank you.
Having said that, to go back to the previous, yourself and the Congress, the legislative authority as opposed to the bureaucratic process that make regulation. I'm not that smart, but law seems to me to be able to be enforced more than a regulation. So having said that, dealing from the legislative arm with the bureaucratic process appears to be the core, not just with the EPA, but the other bureaucratic agencies, nameless. But just curious as to how you may approach that core issue.
Well, I think you're downplaying your intelligence there. I think you get the picture here, and this is the problem. We pass laws that we think are sound. Otherwise, we wouldn't be supporting them. And then you have an agency that, subject to their own interpretation, rolls out the rulemaking, and there you go. You look at it and you say, whoa, is that really what we intended when we passed the Clean Water Act or the Clean Air Act? No. I'll give you one bizarre example. The only regulation that has been pulled back by the administration since the president announced a couple years ago that he was going to weed through all these things and find out where there's extraneous, unnecessary. The only thing that has been pulled back is a regulation that was required by the EPA that those that were producers of milk would have to have a spill response plan, not unlike a spill response plan for anybody that deals with hazardous materials. Now, you're laughing. I laughed when I first heard it because I thought somebody had made it up. And I asked the Administrator Jackson, at a hearing, and by then we had confirmed that in fact this was a regulation by the EPA. As they had interpreted under the Hazardous Spill Cleanup Response Plan, or whatever the legislation is. Don't quote me on that because I'm not correct there. But she confirmed that, well, yes, it is actually a regulation out there, but we don't enforce it. Like, that should therefore make it all okay. Well, why is it there in the first place? And who would have thought that that was what we had intended. I think most people who have a measure of just kind of common sense approach to laws and regulations would say, well, that was not what was intended. But what you have on the ground is a level of lack of oversight. In the legislative branch where we sit, we spend most of our time trying to figure out how to spend the money. We spend very little time exercising the oversight. And regulatory reform, once it leaves us, it's subject to interpretation by the regulators. There is a bill that has been introduced that's out there now that would essentially say if the regulation would impose a cost to the economy in excess of $100 million, then it needs to be signed off by the legislative branch. In other words, the regulators just can't pile on without thinking and appreciating the economic impact. If it's going to impact the residents of the state of Alaska or Iowa or Maine or all the places in between to the tune of what we're talking about, then we should have an opportunity to weigh in. So there are things coming to the surface, and I think they're coming to the surface because there's a recognition that what we're seeing coming out of the agencies is unprecedented in terms of its interpretation, in terms of its overreach into areas that people would say, well, that is clearly not what we intended, and yet we are seeing that play out as well. We've whether it's the fugitive dust, you've all been plugged into fugitive dust. If you let your dust from your farm go over to your farm, you're nailed. You know, what's up with this? Anyway, I digress, but it is the issue of what's going on with regulations right now and the lack of control that I think we have at the legislative level. We can do more if we're able to exercise more oversight, but we need to be addressing that in I think a much more rigorous way. Thank you for your time, your attention, and your interest. Keep doing good things.